The sun hammered the roof of the overland stagecoach like a blacksmith shaping hot iron. It was the late 1880s, and the Arizona Territory offered no apology for its brutality. The air inside the cabin was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and the permeating alkaline dust that managed to seep through even the tightest seams of the leather curtains. Eloise's heart sat squeezed into the corner seat, her spine stiff against the jarring vibrations of the wheels. She was 27 years old, an age that the matrons back in Ohio considered dangerously close to spinsterhood, and she looked every day of it. She was not a delicate flower of the parlor. Her skin, rather than being the porcelain white prized by society, was dusted with a constellation of freckles and tanned by years of working in drafty survey offices near windows that let in too much light. Her shoulders were broad, her hands square and capable, with short fingernails currently stained with India ink. She held a sketchbook open on her lap, the pages trembling with every jolt of the coach, while the other passengers, a nervous doctor named Pembroke, a sleeping salesman, and a young woman named Clara, who seemed terrified of her own shadow, stared out at the monotonous red horizon. Eloise was documenting the topography. She noted the dip of the arroyo, the elevation of the mesas, and the deceptive shadows of the canyon walls. She was traveling to Red Rock Crossing to work for Silas Kane as a cartographer and secretary, a job she had secured only because her handwriting was impeccable and her wage demands were lower than any man's. "They say it was a massacre last week," Dr. Pembroke whispered, leaning forward. His voice was tremulous, meant to be confidential but loud enough to grate on Eloise's nerves. A whole family, burned out of their cabin just 10 miles south of the fort. It is the Navajo. They refused to stay on the reservation. Clara, the young woman with the lace bonnet, shuddered and pulled her shawl tighter, though the heat inside the coach was stifling. "I heard they take the women," she murmured, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and titillation. "They say they take them into the hills and they are never seen again." Eloise did not look up from her sketch. She added shading to a limestone ridge with her charcoal pencil. "It is unlikely," she said, her voice flat and pragmatic. "The Navajo treaties were signed years ago. Most of the violence reported in the papers turns out to be exaggerated to sell copies, or disputes over water rights between cattlemen." The salesman, a man with a bulbous nose and a flask of whiskey he had been nursing since Santa Fe, snorted. "Listen to the expert," he slurred. He looked at Eloise with watery, bloodshot eyes. "You clearly do not know the savage mind, Miss, and if you do not mind my saying, a woman traveling alone, well, you must not have much to lose." Eloise tightened her grip on the pencil until the wood creaked. It was an old wound, easily reopened. She remembered the words of Thomas, her former fiancé, the day he broke the engagement 3 years ago. "Eloise, you are a fine companion for a library, but you are plain. You are sturdy. A man wants a wife he can show off at the Sunday social. When I walk into a room with you, nobody looks. I need someone they will remember." "I have my work," Eloise said coldly, turning her face toward the window. "That is quite enough to lose." The coach began to slow as the horses labored up a steep incline. They were entering a narrow throat of the landscape, a canyon where the red rock walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, blotting out the harsh afternoon sun and casting the road into premature twilight. The wind howled through the gaps in the stone, sounding like a low, mournful flute. Eloise felt a prickle of unease at the base of her neck. It was not the gossip of the passengers that disturbed her. It was the silence of the driver. Usually, the man on the box would be cursing the mules or cracking his whip. Now, the roof above them was silent. Suddenly, a crack, sharp and dry like a snapping branch, echoed off the canyon walls. Then another. "Gunfire!" Dr. Pembroke shrieked, clutching his medical bag to his chest. The coach lurched violently to the left as the horses screamed. The vehicle slammed into a rut, throwing the salesman into Clara's lap and sending Eloise's sketchbook flying. Outside, the world erupted into chaos. "Indian raid!" the salesman yelled, scrambling to find a weapon he did not possess. I told you," through the dust-streaked window. Eloise saw figures moving on the ridges above. They were silhouettes against the slice of blue sky, screaming war cries that echoed terrifyingly in the confined space. Arrows thudded into the wood of the coach, but they were followed by the thunderous report of repeating rifles. Eloise, unlike her screaming companions, did not cower on the floorboards. She stayed low, but she kept her eyes on the window. She was a woman of details. Her entire livelihood depended on noticing the small discrepancies in a landscape, and something here was wrong. She saw a rider gallop alongside the slowing coach. He was bare-chested, painted with streaks of red and black, wearing buckskin breeches and a spray of feathers in his hair. He brandished a tomahawk, screaming a guttural sound, but as he raised his other hand to fire, Eloise saw the weapon clearly. It was a Springfield Model 1873 trapdoor carbine. The wood was polished, the metal blued and oiled. It was not a trade musket. It was a standard-issue United States Army rifle, the kind that had only been distributed to the forts in this territory less than 6 months ago. "Down, get down," Dr. Pembroke shouted, trying to pull Eloise to the floor. The coach slammed into the canyon wall and ground to a halt, the axle snapping with a sickening crunch. The door on the high side was wrenched open, and sunlight poured in, along with the smell of black powder. The salesman, panic overtaking his drunken stupor, saw Eloise's leather satchel near her feet. In his delirium, he seemed to decide that whatever she was guarding her maps, her few dollars was the price of his safety. Or perhaps he simply wanted a shield. "Give it here," the drunkard roared. He lunged at Eloise, grabbing her by the collar of her high-necked blouse. "You useless spinster, give me the bag!" Eloise struck out, her palm connecting hard with his nose, but he was heavy and fueled by adrenaline. He dragged her out of the tilted coach, throwing her onto the red sand. The air was filled with dust and the sharp sting of gunpowder. "Let go!" Eloise gasped, kicking at him. The man pinned her shoulders to the ground, his face twisted in ugly desperation. He raised a fist to strike her, not caring about the savages around them, only intent on venting his terror on the weakest thing he could find. Eloise squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the blow. A dull thud sounded, wet and heavy, like a melon dropped on stone. The weight vanished from her chest. Eloise opened her eyes. The salesman was lying in a heap 3 feet away, unconscious, blood trickling from his temple. Standing over him was a nightmare, or a savior. He was tall, lean as a whipcord, with skin the color of polished copper and hair blacker than the bottom of a well. He wore traditional Navajo dress, a velvet shirt of deep indigo, silver concho belts, and leggings. His face was painted, but not with the chaotic streaks of the attackers on the ridge. He wore 2 simple lines of black ash under his eyes. It was Atsa Yazi. He did not look at the fallen drunkard. His eyes were scanning the ridge, his body tense and coiled. He held a Winchester rifle in one hand and a heavy knife in the other. He had struck the salesman with the butt of the rifle, a precise, calculated movement that wasted no energy. Eloise scrambled backward, her breath catching in her throat. This was a real warrior. The difference between him and the screaming men on the horses was palpable. He moved with a terrifying silence. He turned his head and looked at her. For a moment, time seemed to stretch and thin. Eloise expected hate. She expected the bloodlust she had been warned about in every dime novel and newspaper. But the eyes that met hers were not wild. They were dark, deep, and startlingly intelligent. They assessed her injuries in a second, checked her hands to see if she held a weapon, and then dismissed her as a threat. He stepped forward, and Eloise flinched. Atsa did not speak. He reached down, grabbed her upper arm with a grip like iron, and hauled her to her feet. He did not shove her. He guided her, firmly and quickly, behind the cover of a large fallen boulder that shielded them from the line of fire coming from the ridge. "Stay," he said. The word was English, heavily accented, rough like gravel. He turned back to the fight. He rested his rifle on the rock, sighted, and fired. Up on the ridge, one of the feathered attackers cried out and fell from his horse. Eloise pressed her back against the warm stone, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched him. He was not shooting at the coach. He was shooting at the attackers. He was fighting them. The skirmish was short. From the mouth of the canyon to the east, the clarion call of a bugle cut through the noise. The ground began to tremble with the rhythmic pounding of hooves. The United States cavalry was arriving. "Soldiers!" Atza hissed to himself. On the ridge, the attackers heard the bugle too. The leader, the man Eloise had seen with the army carbine, shouted an order. "Pull back right!" It was English. It was clear, unaccented American English. Eloise peered around the rock. As the attackers turned their horses to flee up a goat trail, she saw the wind catch the headdress of the trailing rider. It slipped. He grabbed it, pulling it off entirely to reveal short, sandy blonde hair and a distinct lack of war paint on the back of his neck. He was wearing a checkered work shirt underneath a vest of fake deerskin. They were white men. Atza saw it too. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He looked at the approaching column of dust that signaled the cavalry, then looked back at Eloise. "Do not speak of me," he said. It was not a threat. It was a command born of necessity. Before she could nod, before she could ask who he was gone. He slipped into a fissure in the canyon wall, vanishing into the shadows and the red rock as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. Seconds later, Colonel Briggs and his detachment of the 4th Cavalry thundered into the scene. The horses were lathered, the men shouting commands. Dust choked the air, turning the afternoon sun into a hazy orange orb. Colonel Briggs swung down from his horse. He was a thick-set man with a mustache waxed into sharp points and eyes that looked like cold marbles. He strode over to the wrecked coach, ignoring the groaning salesman and the weeping Clara, his gaze fixing on the arrows sticking out of the wood. He reached out and snapped the shaft of an arrow, inspecting the fletching. "Navajo!" Briggs spat. He threw the broken shaft to the ground. "Just as the report said, they are getting bolder, attacking a mail coach in broad daylight." Dr. Pembroke, shaking like a leaf, crawled out from the wreckage. It was terrifying. Colonel, hundreds of them screaming like demons. Eloise stepped out from behind the boulder. She brushed the red dust from her skirt, her hands trembling not from fear, but from a sudden, cold anger. "Colonel," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Briggs turned, looking her up and down with dismissive appraisal. "You are unhurt. Madam, you are fortunate. Usually, they do not leave women alive." "It was not a raid," Eloise said. "Or at least, not the kind you think." Briggs frowned, his mustache twitching. "I beg your pardon." "I saw them," Eloise insisted, stepping closer. "The men who attacked us, they were using Springfield carbines, brand new ones, and when they retreated, one of them lost his headgear. He was a white man, colonel. He had blonde hair." Briggs' face hardened. The concern vanished, replaced by a wall of icy authority. "You are in shock. Miss, hysteria plays tricks on the mind." "I am not hysterical," Eloise said, her voice rising. "I am a cartographer. My eyes are my living. I know what I saw. And there was a man, a Navajo man, who helped me. He fought them off." Briggs laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "A Navajo helper. Now I know you have hit your head. Madam, there are no friendly bucks in this canyon. You saw a savage, and your mind is trying to make sense of the terror." He gestured to 2 of his troopers. "Get the passengers into the wagons. We need to get back to Red Rock Crossing before sundown." "But—" "Enough," Briggs snapped. The command cracked like a whip. "I will not have my report cluttered with the hallucinations of a frightened spinster. It was a Navajo raid. The evidence is right here." He kicked the broken arrow he had dropped. 2 young soldiers grabbed Eloise by the arms. They were not rough, but they were firm. They treated her like a child or an invalid, guiding her toward the military supply wagon. "Please, listen to me," Eloise whispered, but she knew it was useless. She looked back at the fissure in the rock where the warrior had disappeared. There was nothing there but shadow and silence. The ride to Red Rock Crossing took another 3 hours. The town was a scar on the landscape, a collection of hasty wooden structures, tents, and half-built brick buildings huddled around the imposing stone walls of the military fort. The air smelled of coal smoke from the railroad extension and the raw sewage of a boomtown that had grown too fast. Eloise was deposited at the Silver Star Inn, a two-story building with peeling paint and a saloon on the ground floor that was already roaring with noise. Her room was small, stiflingly hot, and cost her $2 a night, an exorbitant sum. She washed the dust from her face in a cracked ceramic basin. The water turned red with the soil of the canyon. She looked at herself in the small, clouded mirror above the washstand. The face staring back was tired. There were lines of exhaustion around her mouth. Her hair, usually pinned back severely, was coming loose in wisps that stuck to her damp forehead. Plain, she thought, invisible. That was what Thomas had said. That was what the salesman had seen, someone of no value, someone who could be sacrificed for safety. But then she remembered the canyon. She walked to the window and pushed open the shutters. The night had fallen heavy and absolute over the desert. To the west, the lights of the fort burned, signaling the power of Colonel Briggs and his narrative of civilization versus savagery. To the east, the desert was a void of blackness, mysterious and silent. She closed her eyes and the image returned to her, vivid and unshakable. She saw the copper skin, the lines of ash under the eyes, the fluid grace of the movement that had saved her life. But mostly, she saw his eyes. They had looked at her not as a plain woman, nor as a victim, nor as a prize. They had looked at her with a terrifying, absolute clarity. He had seen her, Atza Yazi. She did not know his name yet, but she knew his presence. He was out there somewhere in that darkness, watching the same stars, hunted by the men who were supposed to be her protectors. Eloise touched her throat, where the dust still lingered. "I am not hysterical," she whispered to the empty room. She turned away from the window, but she did not close it. For the first time in her life, the darkness outside felt safer than the light within. The twist in the canyon had not just broken a wheel. It had fractured her understanding of the world she had just stepped into. And Eloise's heart, the woman who drew maps for a living, realized she had walked off the edge of the known world. The morning sun over Red Rock Crossing did not bring clarity. It brought heat and the smell of raw lumber baking in the arid air. Eloise's heart smoothed the wrinkles in her gray traveling skirt. Though the dust of yesterday seemed permanently embedded in the fabric, she stood before the polished oak door of the Red Rock Mining Consortium, took a breath that tasted of grit, and knocked. Inside, the office was a sanctuary of calculated civilization amidst the wild frontier. Persian rugs covered the rough floorboards, and heavy velvet drapes blocked out the offending desert glare. Behind a mahogany desk sat Silas Kane. He was a man who wore his wealth like armor. His suit was tailored perfectly to his broad frame, his vest embroidered with silk thread, and his hands, unlike the rough paws of the miners outside, were manicured and soft. He stood as Eloise entered, offering a smile that was practiced, polite, and entirely empty of warmth. "Miss Hart," Silas said, his voice a smooth baritone, "I trust you recovered from the unpleasantness on the road yesterday. Colonel Briggs informed me of the attack, a tragedy. It was certainly startling." "Mr. Kane," Eloise replied, keeping her hands clasped tightly before her to hide their trembling. She did not mention the man with the copper skin. In the light of day, amidst the smell of expensive tobacco and ledger paper, the memory felt feverish, almost unreal. "Please, sit." Silas gestured to a leather chair. "I am a man of business, and time is money, as they say in the East. I hired you because your reference letter stated you have the eye of a hawk and the hand of a master draftsman. My current maps are messy. I need precision." He slid a large roll of parchment across the desk. Eloise unfurled it. It was a survey map of the territory, spanning from the Colorado River deep into the Badlands. Her eyes, trained to read the language of lines and contours, scanned it quickly. She saw the proposed rail line, a black vein cutting through the topography. She saw the shaded areas indicating potential silver deposits. And then she saw the red ink, A large, aggressive circle had been drawn around a jagged scar in the landscape known as Coyote Canyon. It was the exact area where the stagecoach had been ambushed. "You are building the line through the canyon?" Eloise asked, her finger hovering over the paper. "That is difficult terrain. The gradient is steep." Silas chuckled, leaning back and lighting a cigar. "Engineering is the art of overcoming nature. Miss Hart, that canyon is the throat of the valley. If we control it, we control the flow of silver to the main line. But there are obstacles. The terrain. The inhabitants," Silas corrected, his eyes hardening slightly. "The Navajo. They cling to that rock as if it were gold. They claim it is sacred ground. I claim it is the future of American industry. We need to push them west, past the ridge. Civilization requires space. Miss Hart." Eloise looked at the map again. The attack yesterday had happened right at the edge of this red circle. If the Navajo were indeed attacking travelers there, it would give the army every justification to clear the canyon by force. It fit too perfectly. "I see," Eloise said, her voice neutral. "You want me to redraw this? I want you to sanitize it," Silas said, blowing a stream of blue smoke toward the ceiling. "Make the water sources clear, mark the defensible positions, and remove the old Indian names. Give them proper American names. We are painting a new world. After all..." A commotion from the street outside interrupted him. It started as a low rumble, the sound of many boots hitting the dirt, and rose quickly to a roar of angry voices. Silas stood up, checking his pocket watch. "Ah, it seems Colonel Briggs has been efficient. Come, Miss Hart, you should see how we handle justice in Red Rock Crossing. It will make you feel safer." Eloise followed him out onto the wooden boardwalk. The heat hit her like a physical blow. The town square, a patch of beaten earth in front of the fort gates, was packed with bodies. Miners covered in coal dust, railroad workers with hammers still in their loops, and women in sunbonnets were all pressing forward, their face twisted with a collective, ugly excitement. In the center of the square, a group of 4 cavalrymen were dragging a man from the back of a wagon. Eloise felt the blood drain from her face. It was him. Yazzie was not standing with the lethal grace she remembered from the canyon. He was battered. His indigo shirt was torn, revealing dark bruises on his ribs. His hands were bound behind his back with thick hemp rope, and a fresh cut bled sluggishly on his forehead, likely from the butt of a rifle. He stumbled as the soldiers shoved him, falling to his knees in the dust. The crowd jeered. A rotten apple flew from the back ranks and struck him on the shoulder. "Murderer!" a woman screamed. "String him up!" a man bellowed. Colonel Briggs stood on a raised wooden platform, posing like a statue of retribution. He raised a gloved hand, and the crowd quieted, though the tension remained, thick and volatile as black powder. "Citizens of Red Rock Crossing," Briggs shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. "You live in fear. You fear for your wives, your children, your livelihoods. Yesterday, a mail coach was brutally attacked. Innocent lives were threatened." He pointed a finger at the kneeling man. "But the United States Army does not sleep. This morning, my scouts tracked the war party. Most scattered like cowards, but we captured their leader. This man, this savage, led the raid that nearly killed our new neighbor, Miss Hart." Hundreds of eyes turned toward Eloise. She stood on the boardwalk beside Silas, feeling exposed and sick. Silas placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of possessive protection that made her skin crawl. "Look at him," Briggs continued. "Yazzie, a troublemaker who has refused the reservation. He thinks he can terrorize us into leaving. What do we say to that?" "Hang him!" the crowd roared in unison. 2 soldiers stepped forward, carrying a coil of heavy rope. They threw the end over the crossbeam of the wooden gate entrance to the fort. It was a hasty, makeshift gallows. Atza raised his head. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the noose swaying in the breeze. He looked straight ahead, his expression carved from stone. "Do you have words, Navajo?" Briggs sneered. "Speak before the devil takes you." Atza spoke. His voice was not loud, but it had a timbre that cut through the murmuring of the mob. "I followed the thieves," he said, his English broken but understandable. "Not my people." "Lies," Briggs shouted. "We found Navajo arrows. We found feathers." "Feathers are easy to steal," Atsa said. "I tracked them, to stop them." "Enough," Briggs signaled to the soldiers. They grabbed Atsa by the arms and hauled him up. They forced him to stand on a crate beneath the beam. The noose was lowered. The rough hemp settled around his neck. Eloise stared. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack them. She saw the man who had pulled her from the dirt. She saw the man who had shielded her body with his own, while bullets chipped the rock around them. She saw the intelligence in his eyes that was currently being extinguished by the hate of 100 strangers. If she stayed silent, she would be safe. She would be the respectable Miss Hart, the victim, the employee of the powerful Silas Kane. She would fit in. If she spoke, she would destroy everything. The soldier reached for the crate to kick it away. "Wait!" The word tore out of Eloise's throat before she had given her brain permission to speak. It was a shrill, desperate sound. She stepped off the boardwalk, pushing past Silas's outstretched arm. She stumbled into the dirt of the square, moving toward the gallows. The crowd parted, confused by this interruption from a white woman. "Stop!" Eloise cried, breathless, stopping 10 feet from Colonel Briggs. Briggs looked down at her, his face flushing with annoyance. "Miss Hart, go back inside. This is not a sight for a lady." "You cannot hang him," Eloise said. Her voice shook, but she forced volume into it. "He is not the one who attacked the coach." A heavy silence fell over the square. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "He is the one who saved me," Eloise stated, looking directly at Briggs, then turning to face the crowd. "When the shooting started, a man tried to hurt me. This man, this Navajo, came out of the rocks. He fought the attacker off. He shielded me. If he wanted to kill white people, why is the only reason I am standing here alive because of him?" Murmurs rippled through the mob. Doubt began to fracture their certainty. "He is confused," Briggs said quickly, his eyes narrowing into slits. "He likely wanted to take you hostage. Miss Hart, you are naive." "I am not naive," Eloise retorted, her anger finally overriding her fear. "And I saw the attackers. They were not Navajo. They were white men. I saw them retreat. I saw them take off their headdresses. They had blonde hair and wore workmen's shirts." The silence shattered. The crowd began to argue amongst themselves. "White men!" someone shouted. "What is she talking about?" Silas Kane descended the steps, his polished boots kicking up dust. He walked to Eloise's side, his face a mask of concern, but his grip on her arm was painful. "The poor woman is in shock," Silas announced to the crowd, his voice smooth as oil. "The trauma of the attack. She does not know what she is saying. Come away, Eloise." "I know exactly what I'm saying." Eloise yanked her arm free. She pointed at Atsa, who was watching her from the crate. His expression had not changed, but his eyes were locked on hers with an intensity that burned. "He saved my life. If you hang him, you are hanging an innocent man, and you are letting the real criminals go free." Briggs looked at the crowd. He saw the hesitation. He saw that the bloodlust had been tempered by confusion. If he kicked the crate now, it would look like a cover-up. He was a politician as much as a soldier. He knew when the tide had turned. "Cut him down," Briggs growled, though the words clearly tasted like bile in his mouth. "Colonel," the soldier asked, confused. "I said cut him down," Briggs barked. "Take him to the stockade. We will investigate these claims. We will hold him for questioning." The rope was loosened. Atsa was shoved off the crate, landing hard on his feet. He did not bow his head. As the soldiers dragged him away toward the stone jailhouse, he turned his head and looked at Eloise. It was a brief glance, acknowledging the debt, but it was also a warning. The crowd began to disperse, but the mood had shifted. They were no longer angry at the Indian. They were angry at the disruption, and their eyes fixed on Eloise. "Indian lover," a woman hissed as she passed Eloise. "Traitor," a man muttered. spitting tobacco juice near her hem. Eloise stood alone in the square. Silas Kane looked at her, his charm completely gone. His eyes were cold, calculating, assessing her now as a liability rather than an asset. "You have a very vivid imagination, Miss Hart," Silas said softly. "It is a dangerous thing to have in this town. You have made yourself very unpopular. I suggest you go to your room and stay there." He turned and walked away, leaving her amidst the swirling dust. That night, Red Rock Crossing was uneasy. The wind rattled the loose boards of the Silver Star Inn, and the laughter from the saloon sounded jagged and harsh. Eloise could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the noose. She saw the hate in the neighbors' faces. She had saved a man's life, and for that, she had become a pariah. She paced her small room. The injustice of it gnawed at her. Briggs had not believed her. Silas had tried to silence her. Why? Why would they ignore the evidence of white attackers restless? She grabbed her shawl and slipped out of the room. She needed air. She descended the back stairs, avoiding the saloon, and walked out into the cool desert night. She found herself walking toward the fort. The stockade was a separate stone building near the supply warehouses. A single lantern burned above the door. She did not intend to go in. She only wanted to be near the truth. But as she approached the side of the warehouse adjacent to the jail, she heard voices. Low, urgent voices. She pressed herself against the rough wood of the warehouse wall, hiding in the deep shadow of a water trough. "You should have let him swing. Briggs!" It was Silas Kane's voice. It lacked the smooth polish he used in public. It was sharp, impatient. "And start a riot with a crazy woman screaming about white attackers." That was Colonel Briggs. "I have to maintain order. Silas, if I hanged him right then, the Department of the Interior would be sending investigators down here to ask why I executed a man with a witness testifying to his innocence." "She is a problem," Silas said. The sound of a match being struck hissed in the dark. "I hired her for her maps, not her conscience. She saw too much." "The Navajo need to be gone from that canyon by next month," Briggs said. "The railroad deadline is tight. If we do not have an Indian war to justify clearing them out, how do you propose we move them, asking nicely?" Eloise clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. The cold reality washed over her. "The raids were working," Silas said. "My men dress up, burn a few wagons, scare the settlers. The public demands action. You go in, clear the canyon for security reasons, and I get my silver and my tracks. It was a perfect circle. Now this savage is sitting in your cell, and that spinster is asking questions." "I will handle the Indian," Briggs said dismissively. "He will try to escape tonight. Regrettably, the guard will have to shoot him. Case closed." "And the girl?" Silas asked. There was a pause. Eloise held her breath until her lungs burned. "She is isolated," Briggs said. "The town already hates her. If she has an accident, or if she simply decides the frontier is too rough and leaves on the next stage, no one will mourn her." "Make sure it is done," Silas said. "I have $300,000 invested in that canyon. I will not let a cartographer and a stray dog ruin it." Footsteps crunched on the gravel as the two men parted ways. Eloise slid down the wall until she hit the dirt. Her legs refused to hold her. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not racism born of ignorance. It was a machine, a cold, calculated machine made of money and blood. Silas Kane and Colonel Briggs were manufacturing a war to steal the land, and Atsa Yazzie was just a prop in their play, meant to be discarded. "He will try to escape tonight," Briggs had said. "The guard will shoot him." Eloise looked at the small, barred window of the jailhouse. Atsa was in there, waiting for a death that had been scheduled for hours from now. She looked back toward the inn. She could pack her bag. She could wait for the morning stage. She could go back to Ohio, where she was just plain, boring Eloise Hart. She would be safe. She would be alive. But she would be a liar. She would be exactly what Thomas had said. She was someone of no consequence. She looked at her hands. They were shaking, but they were strong hands. Hands that drew lines. Hands that defined the world. "Honest," she whispered to herself. She stood up. She did not head back to the inn. She moved deeper into the shadows, toward the back of the jailhouse where the guard was leaning against the door, half asleep with a bottle in his hand. The choice had been made. She was no longer standing on the edge of the map. She was stepping into the territory where there were no roads, only consequences. She was going to break the law. She was going to betray her race. She was going to save the savage again. The shadows behind the stockade were long and smelled of damp straw and stale horse sweat. Eloise's heart moved with a caution that was foreign to her, placing her boots carefully on the packed earth to avoid the crunch of gravel. She held a tin cup of water in one hand and a bundle of clean linen rags in the other. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that seemed loud enough to wake the entire garrison. The guard at the rear door of the makeshift jail was not the diligent sentry Colonel Briggs would have preferred. He was a young private, slumped against a barrel, his hat pulled low, snoring softly with a bottle of cheap whiskey cradled in his lap. Eloise slipped past him, holding her breath, and moved toward the lean-to structure attached to the stone cell where the overflow prisoners were kept when the main block was full. Atsa Yazi was there. He was not inside the cell, but chained to a heavy support post of the stable structure, exposed to the night air but hidden from the street. His hands were bound in iron cuffs, the chain looped tight around the timber. He was awake. As Eloise stepped into the sliver of moonlight cutting across the dirt floor, his eyes snapped open. They were dark, assessing, and devoid of fear, though his face was swollen from the beating he had received in the square. Eloise knelt beside him, the smell of copper blood and dust sharp in her nose. "Drink," she whispered, holding the cup to his cracked lips. Atsa pulled back slightly, his muscles tensing. He looked at the water, then at her face. He seemed to be searching for a trap. "It is water," Eloise said, her voice trembling. "Not poison, please." He leaned forward and drank, gulping the liquid down with a desperation he had hidden until now. When the cup was empty, he leaned his head back against the rough wood of the post. "You should not be here," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "Your people will hurt you." "They already want to hurt you," Eloise replied, dipping a rag into the small bucket she had brought. She reached out to wipe the dried blood from a gash above his eye. He flinched, but did not pull away. "I know you did not attack that coach. Knowing changes nothing," Atsa said. "The colonel needs a hanging. I am the neck he found." "I saw the men," Eloise insisted, dabbing at the wound. "I saw their hair. I know Silas Kane is involved. I heard him talking to Briggs." Atsa looked at her then, really looked at her, with an intensity that made Eloise flush. It was not a romantic look. It was the look of a soldier recognizing an ally in an unexpected place. "I am a scout," he said quietly. "For my people, the Dine. We have seen these ghosts, men who dress like us, burn ranches, steal cattle. They leave arrows that belong to my tribe, but they ride like cavalry." "Why?" Eloise asked. "To start a war. To steal the canyon," Atsa answered. "I warned the elders. I told them the metal road, the railroad, wants the throat of the mountain. They did not believe the white men would break the treaty so soon. I was tracking the ghosts when I found your coach. I thought I could stop them, take one alive to show the colonel. Instead, you saved me," Eloise said softly. "A mistake, perhaps," Atsa murmured, "though there was no malice in it. Now I die, and the canyon falls." "No," Eloise said, pulling back. She stood up, her hands balling into fists. "Not if I can help it." The next morning, the sun rose with a vengeance, bleaching the color out of the sky before 8 o'clock. Eloise sat at her desk in the office of the Red Rock Mining Consortium, her spine rigid. Silas Kane was absent, attending a breakfast meeting with the town investors, leaving Eloise alone with the documents that would decide the fate of the territory. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. She had the official survey map spread out on the table, the one Silas had asked her to sanitize. Beside it, she placed a rougher, military-grade chart she had pilfered from a stack of rejected papers in the corner. Silas wanted the Indian names removed. He wanted the water sources marked. But as Eloise cross-referenced the two maps, she began to see a pattern that chilled her blood. On Silas's private draft, there were small, neat marks made in red ink. An X here, an X there. They were clustered along the proposed railroad through Coyote Canyon and the adjacent valley. Eloise took her magnifying glass and peered at the military map. The locations of the X marks did not correspond to silver deposits. They did not correspond to water tables or timber stands. They corresponded to winter camps, hogans, sheep grazing lands. The marks were not geological targets. They were human ones. Silas Kane was not just planning a mine. He was planning an extermination. He intended to drive the rail line directly through the heart of the wintering grounds, and the Indian raids were the pretext to bring the army in to clear the hostiles beforehand. She grabbed a sheet of tracing paper and began to copy the locations furiously. She needed proof. She needed to show someone, perhaps the federal inspector that was rumored to be coming from Santa Fe in a month. But a month was too long. Atza did not have a month. The door handle rattled. Eloise froze. She shoveled the military map under the large survey chart and grabbed her pen. When Silas Kane walked in, smelling of bay rum and expensive cigars, she was calmly inking the border of a river. "Diligent as ever, Miss Hart," Silas said. Hanging his hat on the rack, he walked over to the desk. Placing a hand on the back of her chair, he leaned in close, too close. "I hope you have put yesterday's hysteria behind you. The town is talking. Eloise, it does not look good for a woman of your position to be sympathetic to a savage." "I am only sympathetic to the truth, Mr. Kane," Eloise said, keeping her eyes on the ink. "But I understand my position." "Good," Silas said, patting her shoulder with a condescension that made her skin crawl. "Colonel Briggs tells me he is moving the prisoner today, transferring him to the district court in Prescott. It is for the best. Once he is gone, things will quiet down." Eloise's hand slipped, the pen leaving a small blot of ink on the paper. Transfer. She knew what that meant. It was the accident she had heard them planning. She stood up, turning to face him. "I need to go with them." Silas blinked, his smile faltering. "Excuse me." "The survey." Eloise lied, her mind racing to build a scaffold of logic. "You want the canyon mapped accurately. You said the gradient is steep. If the colonel is taking a wagon through the pass to Prescott, it is the perfect opportunity for me to survey the route under military escort. I can verify the water sources you asked for." Silas studied her. His eyes were cold, calculating beads. He suspected something, but his greed was a louder voice. He needed that map finished before the investors arrived next week. And if Eloise Hart happened to be on a dangerous road with a violent prisoner, well, the desert was a harsh place for a woman. "It is dangerous," Silas said slowly, "but efficient. I will speak to Briggs. Pack your things. Miss Hart, you leave at noon." The walk back to the inn to pack her satchel was a gauntlet. The news of her outburst at the hanging had metastasized overnight. As she passed the general store, two women in fine bonnets stopped their conversation and turned their backs to her. Eloise heard the hiss of their whispers. "That is her, the one who touched the Indian. Disgraceful." "I heard she went to the jail last night. Can you imagine a woman of her age throwing herself at a buck? Desperate? That is what it is. No white man would have her, so she takes what she can find in the dirt." The words struck Eloise like physical blows. She kept her head high, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. But inside, she was shrinking, desperate, ugly, unwanted. The labels she had run away from in Ohio had found her here, magnified by the lens of racial hatred. A group of miners lounging on the porch of the saloon laughed as she passed. One of them, a man with a missing front tooth, called out, "Hey, Miss Hart, you got a thing for feathers. I got a chicken out back if you are lonely." The laughter followed her down the dusty street. Eloise felt the heat rising in her cheeks, a burning mix of shame and rage. They did not see a cartographer. They did not see a witness. They saw a pathetic spinster who had betrayed her race for a savage. She reached her room and packed with trembling hands. She threw in her compass, her canteens, and a small, pearl-handled revolver she had bought in St. Louis and never fired. Let them talk, she thought fiercely. Let them laugh. I know what I saw. The convoy assembled at the edge of town at 12 o'clock high. The heat was oppressive, a physical weight pressing down on the earth. The sky was a bleached, sickly white. There was one prisoner transport wagon, a heavy, iron-reinforced box on wheels drawn by 4 mules. Atza was inside, chained to the floor. 6 cavalrymen on horseback provided the escort. Colonel Briggs was not coming. He had delegated the dirty work to a Sergeant Miller, a man with a face like a bulldog and eyes that promised nothing but cruelty. Eloise was given a seat on the buckboard of the prisoner wagon, next to the driver, a young corporal who looked nervous. "Stay on the wagon, ma'am," Sergeant Miller growled, chewing on a plug of tobacco. "We ain't stopping for niceties. We got 40 miles of bad road." The procession moved out. Leaving the safety of Red Rock Crossing behind, they headed west toward the jagged maw of the canyon. For the first 2 hours, the only sounds were the creaking of the wheels and the rhythmic thud of hooves. Eloise tried to sketch the passing landscape, but her eyes kept drifting to the small, barred window behind her head. She could hear the clink of chains every time the wagon hit a rut. The air began to change around 3 o'clock. The wind died completely. The silence became heavy, charged with static electricity. The hairs on Eloise's arms stood up. She looked to the horizon. A dark bruise was forming in the west, purple and angry. It was not a rain cloud. It was too low, too solid. "Haboob," the young driver whispered, gripping the reins tighter. "Push on," Sergeant Miller shouted from his horse. "Beat the storm to the ridge." They whipped the mules, the wagon lurching forward violently, but the wall of dust moved faster than any horse. It swallowed the sun, turning the afternoon into a choking twilight. The wind hit them with the force of a hammer. One moment, Eloise could see the canyon walls. The next, the world was erased. Red sand, stinging like ground glass, filled the air. It filled her nose, her mouth, her eyes. "Halt, halt!" Miller screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the wind. The mules panicked. The led pair reared, terrified by the stinging sand. The wagon swerved wildly to the left, the wheels leaving the road and hitting the loose scree of the slope. "Hold on!" the driver yelled. Eloise grabbed the iron rail of the seat. The world tilted, with a groan of stressed wood. The heavy prisoner wagon tipped over. Eloise was thrown clear. She hit the sand hard, rolling over her shoulder. The breath knocked out of her. She came to rest against a scrub bush, coughing, spitting grit. She looked up. The wagon was on its side, the wheels spinning lazily in the gale. The driver was groaning on the ground a few yards away. The escort soldiers were scattered, their horses bucking and vanishing into the brown haze. She heard a shout from the wagon. "Get him out, or shoot him!" It was Sergeant Miller's voice. He loomed out of the dust, dismounted, stumbling toward the wrecked wagon. He had his service revolver drawn. Eloise scrambled to her feet. She realized what was happening. The accident had arrived early. Miller was going to claim the prisoner tried to escape in the crash, or was crushed. He was going to put a bullet in Atza while he was trapped. "No!" Eloise screamed, though the wind tore the sound away. She ran toward the wagon. The rear doors had burst open upon impact. Inside, in the gloom, she saw Atza. He was battered, hanging awkwardly from the chains that secured him to the floorboards, which were now a vertical wall. Sergeant Miller was climbing into the back, raising his gun. Eloise did not think. She did not calculate. She lunged. She grabbed a heavy iron pry bar that had fallen from the driver's toolkit and swung it. She was not a warrior. She was a woman who drew lines. But desperation gave her strength. The bar connected with Miller's arm just as he pulled the trigger. The gun discharged, the bullet going wild, striking the iron shackle bolt embedded in the wood near Atza's hand. Miller roared in pain and turned on Eloise, backhanding her across the face. Eloise fell back, tasting blood. But the bullet had done the impossible. The lead ball had shattered the stressed wood where the bolt was anchored. Atza braced his legs against the wall and pulled. With a crack of splintering timber, the bolt tore free. He was still cuffed, but he was no longer attached to the wagon. Miller raised his gun again, aiming at Eloise this time. "You stupid bitch!" Atza moved. He swung the heavy length of chain attached to his wrist like a whip. The iron link struck Miller in the temple. The sergeant dropped like a sack of grain, unconscious before he hit the floor. Atza scrambled out of the wagon, crouching low. The wind was howling, the visibility less than 5 feet. "We must go!" he yelled, grabbing Eloise's arm. My maps," Eloise stammered, dazed. "Leave them." Atza hauled her up. A riderless horse, maddened by the storm, galloped out of the dust, hooves flailing. It headed straight for them. Eloise froze. Atza did not. He tackled her, throwing them both into the lee of a large boulder just as the horse thundered past, its hoof striking the rock where Eloise's head had been a second before. They lay there for a moment, tangled together in the roaring dark. Atza's breathing was ragged. Eloise was shaking uncontrollably. "The soldiers will regroup," Atza shouted into her ear. "When the wind stops, they will hunt. Come." He pulled her up. He did not run away from her. He did not leave her to the mercy of the sergeant. He kept his grip on her arm, firm and grounding. He led her away from the road, away from the wreck, plunging into a narrow fissure in the canyon wall that Eloise would never have seen. They squeezed through the crack in the rock, the walls pressing in on them, until the roar of the wind began to fade, muffled by the stone. They walked for what felt like hours, deeper into the labyrinth of the earth, putting miles of stone between themselves and the road. Finally, the storm began to die. The howling wind dropped to a moan, then a whisper. The air cleared, leaving a thick layer of dust on everything. They emerged into a small box canyon, a cul-de-sac of red stone hidden from the world. Atza let go of her arm. He slumped against the canyon wall, sliding down to sit in the dirt. He looked at the broken chain dangling from his wrist. Then he looked at Eloise. Eloise stood in the center of the clearing. Her expensive traveling dress was torn. Her face was bruised from Miller's hand. Her hair was a wild tangle of dust and knots. She had lost her hat, her maps, and her reputation. She was a fugitive. She had assaulted a federal officer. She had aided a condemned man. She looked at Atza. He was a criminal in the eyes of the law, a savage in the eyes of the town. "They will kill us if they find us," Eloise said, her voice sounding strange in the silence. Atza nodded. "Yes." He looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something like respect true. Deep respect softened his hard face. "You swing a heavy iron, mapmaker," he said. Eloise looked at her hands. They were scraped and bleeding, but they were steady. She took a breath of the cooling desert air. She had no water. She had no food. She had only the man sitting before her. "I am not a mapmaker anymore," she whispered. "I suppose I am an outlaw." Atza slowly extended his hand. It was an invitation, an acknowledgement of their shared fate. "Then we are the same," he said. "Outlaws, walking the edge." Eloise looked at his hand, then reached out and took it. His grip was warm, rough, and undeniably real. Above them, the first stars began to pierce the dusty veil of the sky. Indifferent to the laws of men, watching 2 specks of life in the vast, red silence. The sun over the Badlands did not just shine, it judged. It beat down on the jagged spine of the earth with a relentless, blinding fury that turned the air into shimmering waves of heat. Eloise's heart stumbled, her boots scraping against the unforgiving shale, but a strong hand caught her elbow before she could fall. Atza Yazi did not speak. He simply steadied her, his grip firm and impersonal, and pointed toward a narrow fissure in the canyon wall that looked like nothing more than a shadow from a distance. It was a zigzag path, a secret vein in the rock that only the deer and the dine knew. They had been walking for 10 hours. The wreckage of the prisoner wagon and the unconscious form of Sergeant Miller were miles behind them, buried under the silence of the desert. Eloise's lungs burned with every breath. Her throat felt like it was lined with felt. She was a woman who had spent her life drawing lines on paper, sitting in chairs, drinking tea from porcelain cups. Now, she was walking off the edge of the known world. Water, Atsa said, his voice rasping slightly. Soon. He led her through the twisting labyrinth of stone. The walls rose high on either side, blocking out the cruel sun and plunging them into a cool, purple twilight. Finally, the path widened into a small, hidden alcove, a natural amphitheater carved by millennia of wind and water. At the back, fed by a vein deep within the mesa, water wept from the rock face, gathering in a small, clear pool bordered by hardy ferns. Eloise collapsed beside the pool. She did not care about dignity. She cupped her hands and drank. The water was cold, tasting of minerals and earth. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. Atsa drank after her, kneeling with the grace of a mountain lion. He splashed water on his face, washing away the dried blood from the cut on his forehead and the dust of the prison wagon. When he stood, he moved to the mouth of the alcove, checking their back trail. We rest here, he said. The soldiers will not find this place. It is not on their maps. It is not on mine, either, Eloise murmured, looking around. She realized with a jolt that for the first time in her career, she had no idea where she was. She was completely dependent on the man the army called a savage. That first night was a test of nerves. The desert temperature plummeted as soon as the sun vanished. Eloise sat near the back of the cave, shivering in her torn traveling dress. She hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes tracking Atsa as he moved in the gloom. He built a fire, but it was small, a coyote fire. He called it later made of dry sage and driftwood that burned with almost no smoke. He sat on the opposite side of the flames, keeping a deliberate distance. He seemed to sense her fear, the ingrained terror of a white woman raised on stories of scalpings and abductions. He took a piece of dried meat from a pouch at his belt, tore it in half, and tossed a piece to her. Eat, he said. You need strength. Eloise chewed the tough, salty jerky. Thank you, she whispered. Atsa did not reply. He sat cross-legged, his rifle across his lap, staring into the fire. The silence stretched between them, heavy and awkward. Why? Eloise asked suddenly. Her voice sounded loud in the small space. Atsa looked up. Why what? Why did you come back? She asked. In the wagon. You were free. The bolt broke. You could have jumped. You could have run while Miller was shooting at me. Why did you stay to hit him? Atsa studied her face, the firelight dancing in his dark eyes. You fought for me, he said simply. In the town square, you spoke when others were silent. A warrior does not leave a debt unpaid. I am not a warrior, Eloise said bitterly. She looked at her hands, which were scratched and raw. I am a cartographer who cannot find her way home. You swing a heavy iron, Atsa noted, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. That is warrior enough. The comment loosened something in Eloise's chest. The fear began to recede, replaced by a profound exhaustion and a sudden need to unburden herself. I was supposed to be married, she said, staring at the flames. 4 years ago, his name was Thomas. He was a solicitor, very respectable. Atsa listened, his face impassive. He left me 2 weeks before the wedding. Eloise continued. He told me he had met someone else, a girl named Clara. He said Clara was like a rose, and I was like a reliable oak table. He said, Eloise, you're useful, but you are not someone a man dreams about. You are plain. People forget your face the moment you leave the room. She laughed, a harsh, dry sound. So I came west. I thought if I drew the maps, if I named the mountains, then I would matter. I would not be invisible. Atsa remained silent for a long time. He reached out and adjusted a stick in the fire, sending a spray of orange sparks upward. The white men tell many lies, Atsa said quietly. But the worst lies are the ones they tell about what matters. He looked at her. My people, the Dine. We walked a long road. The long walk. The soldiers came Kit Carson and his men and they burned our peach trees. They killed our sheep. They forced us to walk hundreds of miles to a place called Bosque Redondo. It was a flat, ugly land. The water made us sick. Eloise listened, horrified. She had heard of the relocation, but only as a footnote in a government report. "My grandmother died on that walk," Atsa said, his voice devoid of self-pity but heavy with memory. "She was old. When she could not keep up, the soldiers shot her. They said it was mercy. They promised us food, blankets, safety. They gave us nothing but death. Since then, I do not listen to the words of white men. I listen to the wind. I listen to the earth. They do not lie." "I am sorry," Eloise whispered. The words felt inadequate, tiny against the scale of such tragedy. "Do not be sorry," Atsa said. "Be alive. That is the only answer to them." He lay back against his saddle roll, closing his eyes. "Sleep, mapmaker. Tomorrow we walk." 2 days passed in the canyon. Eloise learned that silence was a language. She learned to read the sky for weather, to watch the lizards to find shade. She watched Atsa. She watched how he moved with an economy of energy, never wasting a step. He was teaching her, though he rarely gave direct instruction. He would point to a track in the sand, a sidewinder snake, and wait for her to nod before moving on. On the third afternoon, the heat broke violently. Thunderheads piled up over the mesa, turning the sky the color of a bruised plum. The air grew heavy and electric. Then, the rain came. It was not a gentle shower. It was a deluge. Water poured from the heavens, turning the dry creek beds into roaring torrents in minutes. They took shelter in a shallow overhang near the top of a ridge. The space was cramped. The rain lashed against the stone, creating a curtain of water that sealed them in. Eloise was soaked to the bone. Her hair, usually pinned up in a severe bun, had come undone, plastering against her neck and cheeks in wet, dark tendrils. Her dress clung to her, heavy and cold. She shivered violently. Atsa moved closer to shield her from the wind. He was close enough that she could smell the scent of him rain, sage and wood smoke. Eloise wiped the water from her face. She caught her reflection in a small pool that had formed on the stone floor of the overhang. A flash of lightning illuminated her visage. She saw the sunburn on her nose. She saw the peeling skin on her forehead. She saw the scar on her chin where she had fallen against the wagon. She saw the broadness of her jaw, the lack of delicacy that Thomas had despised. She looked away, ashamed to be seen like this by anyone, even a fugitive. "I am not pretty," she whispered. The confession fell out of her mouth, lost in the sound of the rain. But Atsa heard her. He was sitting with his back against the stone, one knee drawn up. He turned his head slowly. His eyes, usually scanning the horizon for danger, locked onto her face. They traveled over her wet hair, her flushed cheeks, her trembling mouth. There was no mockery in his gaze. There was no polite pity. There was only a terrifying directness. "All the better," he replied, his voice low, cutting under the thunder. "I need honest, not fancy." Eloise blinked, stunned. "What?" Atsa shifted, turning his body fully toward her. "The women in the town," he said, gesturing vaguely toward where Red Rock Crossing lay. "They paint their faces. They wear wire cages under their dresses to change their shape. They hide from the sun. They smile when they hate. They are like the paper flowers in the general store. Pretty, but dead." He reached out. For a moment, Eloise thought he would pull back, but his hand continued its path. His fingertips, calloused from the rifle and the reins, brushed the line of her jaw. It was a touch as light as a moth's wing, yet it sent a shockwave through her entire body. "Pretty can lie," Atsa said. "Paint and powder. Honest cannot. Your face tells the truth of sun, wind, work. That is beauty to me." He traced the small scar on her chin with his thumb. "This is a story of survival. Why would you want to hide it?" Eloise stopped shivering. The cold seemed to evaporate, replaced by a heat that radiated from where his skin touched hers. She looked at his hand, dark, scarred, strong, resting against her pale, freckled skin. It was a contrast that should not have worked, but in the dim light of the storm, it looked right. "Thomas said no one would remember me," she whispered. the old hurt surfacing one last time. "Thomas was blind," Atsa said firmly. "I will remember you. The mountains will remember you." He did not kiss her. It was not that kind of moment. It was something deeper. It was an anchoring. He held her gaze for a long moment, stripping away the layers of insecurity she had worn for years, leaving her naked in her own skin, and telling her that the skin was enough. Then, slowly, he withdrew his hand, the moment held in the air, vibrating like a plucked bowstring. "The rain is stopping," he said, his voice returning to its usual practical tone, though his eyes remained warm. Eloise let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Yes," she said, "it is." The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the desert washed clean and smelling of creosote. But something had shifted irrevocably between them. They were no longer just allies of circumstance. The next 2 days were a revelation. Eloise began to ask questions. She pointed to a bird circling overhead. "Turkey vulture," she said. "CDE," Atsa corrected. He made her repeat the guttural sounds until she got it right, laughing softly when her tongue tripped over the glottal stops. In return, she taught him English. He pointed to the vast expanse of the canyon. "Big," he said. "Magnificent," Eloise corrected. "Magnificent." Atsa tested the word, rolling it around in his mouth. He shook his head. "Too many teeth in that word. Big is better." Eloise laughed, a genuine, full-throated sound that surprised her. "Perhaps you are right. Simple is often better." They were heading toward a high ridge that overlooked the northern approach to Coyote Canyon. Atsa had a suspicion that the ghosts, the fake raiders, had a camp nearby. The climb was grueling. It involved scrambling up loose scree and hauling themselves over boulders the size of carriages. A week ago, Eloise would have fainted. Today, she gritted her teeth, dug her boots in, and kept pace. When she slipped, she corrected her own balance. She saw Atsa nod in approval. They reached the crest of the ridge just before noon. They lay flat on their stomachs, peering over the edge. Below them, in a box canyon completely hidden from the main road, was a camp. There were tents, a corral with horses, and a large wagon covered in canvas. "Look," Atsa whispered, handing her a small brass spyglass he carried. Eloise put the glass to her eye. The circle of magnification brought the scene into sharp focus. There were men down there, white men. She recognized one of them, a shift boss from Silas Kane's mine. He was sitting on a crate, smoking a pipe. But it was what was happening near the wagon that made her gasp. 2 men were standing by a table. They were wearing standard workman's trousers and boots. But on the table lay piles of clothing, buckskin leggings, velvet shirts, and elaborate feather headdresses. As she watched, one of the men picked up a headdress. It was a crude imitation of a Navajo war bonnet, the kind sold in tourist shops back east, inaccurate and gaudy. He put it on, tying the chin strap. Then he picked up a pot of paint and began to smear red streaks across his pale chest. Another man walked out of a tent carrying a bundle of rifles. He handed them out. They were not old trade muskets. They were brand new Winchesters. "They are rehearsing," Eloise whispered, horror cold in her stomach. "Like actors in a play. A play written in blood," Atsa said, his voice hard as flint. "They dress up, they ride out, they burn a Navajo hogan or a white ranch, they leave the feathers, and the army comes to kill my people." Eloise moved the spyglass. She saw crates stacked near the wagon. They were marked Kane Mining Consortium, explosives. "Silas is supplying them," she said. "He is paying his own employees to play Indian. It creates the panic. The panic brings the soldiers. The soldiers clear the land, and Silas gets his silver." She lowered the glass. The truth was laid bare in the canyon below. It was not a clash of civilizations. It was a business transaction, cold and murderous. "We have to stop them," Eloise said. "We are 2 people," Atsa said. "They are 20, and they have the colonel in their pocket." "We do not need to fight them all," Eloise said, her mind racing. "We need proof. We need to take this back to Red Rock Crossing." The federal inspector. Silas mentioned he was coming eventually, but we cannot wait for him. If we go back, Atsa said, looking at her, Briggs will hang me, and Silas will kill you. If we do not go back, Eloise countered, they will wipe out your winter camps next week. I saw the map. Atsa, the red marks. They are going to bomb the canyon walls to close off the pass, and they don't care who is inside. Atsa looked down at the camp, then back at the vast, red landscape of his ancestors. He looked at Eloise. He saw the sunburn, the determination, the honesty he had praised. To go back is to walk into the wolf's mouth, he said. Then we had better have sharp teeth, Eloise replied. Atsa smiled, a fierce, dangerous baring of teeth. You are learning. Mapmaker. We will go back, but not to surrender. We go to hunt. He checked the load in his rifle. Eloise checked the cylinder of her small, pearl-handled revolver. It looked ridiculous next to his Winchester, but her hand did not shake. They slid back from the ridge, moving into the shadows, leaving the safety of the wild for the danger of civilization. The rising action was over. The climax was waiting for them in the dust of Red Rock Crossing. The red rocks of the hidden canyon seemed to hold their breath as Atsa, Yazzie, and Eloise Hart rode into the encampment. It was a place of shadows and secrets, a natural fortress where the dying families who refused the reservation had gathered. The air smelled of burning pinyon wood and roasted mutton, but beneath it lay the sharp, metallic scent of fear. They were not welcomed with open arms. Young warriors, their faces painted with ash, stepped forward with rifles leveled at Eloise. She sat stiffly on the horse Atsa had stolen from the military convoy, her hands gripping the pommel until her knuckles turned white. She was the enemy here, a face of the race that had brought the long walk and the starvation. Atsa dismounted, his movement fluid despite his exhaustion. He spoke in Navajo, his voice ringing off the canyon walls. Eloise did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was urgent, pleading, and commanding. An elder stepped out from the largest hogan. His hair was the color of winter frost, and his face was a map of deep canyons. This was Hastian Bia, the leader of this band. He listened to Atsa, his dark eyes flickering toward Eloise with suspicion. Atsa turned to her. Show them, he said in English. Show them what you drew. Eloise slid off the horse. Her legs trembled, not from fatigue, but from the weight of the moment. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the map, the one with the red ink, the one she had stolen from Silas Kane's desk. She spread it on the flat surface of a sandstone rock. The wind tugged at the corners, but she held it down with stones. Tell them, Eloise said, looking at Atsa. Tell them I am a maker of maps. Tell them that these lines are the Iron Road. And tell them what the red marks mean, Atsa translated. The elder leaned in, squinting at the paper. Here, Eloise pointed to a cluster of red crosses. This is where we stand now. And here, she pointed to the south, this is the camp of Redwater. And here is Blue Mesa. She looked up, meeting the elder's gaze. The man named Kane, the one who digs for silver, has marked these places. He does not mark them for trade. He marks them for removal. He plans to blow the canyon walls to seal the pass, and he wants the people gone before the dust settles. A murmur went through the gathered crowd. It was a sound of anger mixed with grief. A young warrior, hot-blooded and fierce, shouted something, waving his rifle toward the mountains. He says we should run. Atsa translated for her, his voice low. He says we should go deep into the Chuska Mountains, where the white men cannot bring their wagons. If you run, Eloise said, her voice gaining strength, you lose the land. That is what Silas wants. He wants you to disappear so he can claim the canyon was empty. He wants to erase you from the map. She placed her hand flat on the paper, covering the red marks. But if we show the world that he lied, if we show the army that he staged the raids to steal this land, then the law might stop him. The debate raged for an hour. It was a clash of generations, the urge to fight, the urge to flee, and the terrifying hope that standing their ground might work. Finally, Hastian Bia raised a hand. We will not run, Atsa said, turning to Eloise. Half the warriors will ride to the other camps. They will move the families to the high caves for safety, but they will not leave the land. And the rest? Eloise asked. The rest ride with us, Atsa said, to Red Rock Crossing. We bring the feathers. We bring the map. We bring the truth. The ride back to civilization felt like a funeral procession. The sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the desert floor. Eloise rode beside Atsa, the evidence packed tightly in her saddlebags, the fake headdress made of dyed chicken feathers, the empty casing of a government-issue cartridge found at the fake raid site, and the map. They reached the outskirts of Red Rock Crossing just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and orange. The town was not asleep. Lanterns burned in every window, and a strange, agitated energy pulsed through the streets. They are waiting for us, Atsa murmured. He checked the load of his rifle. How do you know? I can smell it, he replied. Like ozone before lightning, they did not sneak in. They rode straight down the main thoroughfare, flanked by 4 Navajo warriors. The sound of hooves on hard-packed dirt drew people out of the saloon and the boarding houses. By the time they reached the square in front of the mining office, a crowd had formed, and standing on the wooden steps, as if he were the king of this dusty domain, was Silas Kane. Beside him stood Colonel Briggs, surrounded by a dozen armed troopers. Halt! Briggs shouted. The soldiers raised their carbines. Atsa pulled his horse to a stop. Eloise did the same. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, the same eyes that had watched her with scorn before. Now, they held something darker anticipation. So, Silas Kane said, his voice smooth and carrying easily in the stillness. The prodigal secretary returns, and she has brought her pet savage. I have brought the truth, Silas, Eloise said. Her voice shook, but she forced it to be loud. She reached into her bag and pulled out the fake headdress. She threw it onto the ground at the feet of the colonel's horse. Look at it, she screamed at the crowd. Look at the stitching. It is machine thread. It is dyed with chemical paint. This is not Navajo work. This is a costume, the crowd murmured. People craned their necks to see the bundle of feathers in the dirt. And this, Eloise pulled out the map. This is your plan, Silas, to murder these people for a railway right-of-way. Silas did not flinch. He laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. A costume, Silas mocked. Or perhaps something you and your lover stitched together in a cave to save his neck. You are a traitor. Miss Hart, a woman of loose morals who ran off with a murderer. Who will believe you, these good people? He gestured to the crowd. She betrays her race. She sleeps with the enemy and then comes back to tell us that we are the villains. Treason, Colonel Briggs barked. That is the charge. Aiding a fugitive. Conspiracy against the United States government. Seize them! The soldiers surged forward. Atsa raised his rifle, but there were too many of them. A butt of a carbine struck him in the ribs, knocking him from his horse. Eloise screamed as rough hands grabbed her, dragging her down into the dust. No, listen to me, she cried, fighting against the grip of 2 soldiers. Her dress tore at the shoulder. Her cheek was scraped against the gravel, but she held onto the map with a death grip. They dragged Atsa to the center of the square. They did not bother with a trial this time. A rope was already waiting. String him up, a miner yelled. And the woman too, she's worse than him. The mob mentality took over. It was a living, breathing beast of hate. Eloise was hauled up the steps, forced to her knees beside Silas's polished boots. She looked up at him. You will burn for this, she hissed. I am a rich man, Eloise, Silas whispered, leaning down. Rich men do not burn. We own the fire. He turned to the crowd. Let this be a lesson. Civilization demands purity. We cannot allow. He paid me $50. The voice cut through the shouting like a knife. The crowd froze. From the shadow of the saloon porch, a woman stepped forward. It was Lydia, the singer with the weary eyes and the reputation that was as tattered as Eloise's. Lydia walked into the light. She was trembling, but her chin was high. He paid me $50 to sew those feathers, Lydia said, pointing a shaking finger at Silas. He said it was for a theater show in Santa Fe, but I saw his foreman wearing one when they rode out last week." "She is a whore," Silas shouted, his composure cracking. "She is drunk." "And I saw the money transfer," a young man's voice rang out. Eloise gasped. It was Jamie, her younger brother. He pushed his way through the crowd, dusty from the stagecoach ride he must have just taken to find her. He looked terrified, but he looked at his sister, bloody and kneeling, and found his courage. "I was at the telegraph office," Jamie shouted. "A wire from Kane to the supplier in Chicago. Rifles received, native disguise effective, proceed with clearance. The clerk showed it to me because he thought it was strange." "Lies!" Briggs roared. "Arrest them all." But the crowd was wavering. The miners, the shopkeepers, they were hard people, but they were not all monsters. They looked at the cheap feathers. They looked at the map. They looked at the terrified determination on Eloise's face. "Wait a minute, Colonel," an old prospector grumbled, stepping forward. "If that silver ain't on Navajo land, then why are we killing them?" "Because I say so," Silas screamed, losing control. "Because I own this town, I own the mine. And I will not let a few savages and a spinster stop progress." Boom! The ground heaved. It was not a metaphorical shake. The earth literally jumped beneath their feet. A second later, a deafening roar rolled down from the hills north of the town. Everyone turned. A massive plume of black smoke and rock was rising into the twilight sky from the location of the Kane silver mine. "The powder," Silas whispered, his face draining of color. "The fools! They used too much." He had ordered the charges set early to collapse the entrance to the old shafts where he had stored the illegal rifles, wanting to hide the evidence before any inspection. But he had underestimated the volatility of the dynamite in the heat. "My silver!" Silas yelled. He shoved Eloise aside and ran toward his horse. "The vault! It is in the main shaft!" The explosion had done more than collapse a shaft. The shockwave had destabilized the entire ridge. As the townspeople watched in horror, the side of the hill began to slide. A landslide of rock and timber crashed down, burying the mine entrance and the buildings around it. Screams drifted down from the mine. There were men up there. The night shift. Panic erupted in the square. The soldiers forgot about Atsa. The crowd forgot about the hanging. "Help them!" a woman screamed. "My husband is up there!" Atsa stood up. His hands were still bound, but the soldier holding the rope had dropped it to stare at the destruction. He looked at the chaos. He looked at the open desert to the west. He could run. In this confusion, he and Eloise could vanish. The white men were dying in a trap of their own making. It was justice. It was the earth fighting back. "Atsa!" Eloise scrambled to her feet. She ran to him, fumbling for the knife at his belt to cut his bonds. "We have to go now." Atsa looked at her. Then he looked at the mine. He heard the screams of men trapped under the rock. He saw the prospector who had defended them running toward the slope with a shovel. "They wanted to kill you," Eloise cried, sawing at the ropes. "Let them rot!" The ropes snapped. Atsa rubbed his wrists. He looked at Eloise with those dark, honest eyes. "If I leave them," he said, "then I am what they say I am, a savage." He turned and ran, not away from the town, toward the mine. "Wait!" Eloise screamed, but he was already moving, sprinting up the slope toward the cloud of dust and fire. Eloise stood there for a heartbeat, torn between survival and something greater. Then she turned to Colonel Briggs, who was sitting on his horse, paralyzed by the destruction of his career and his allies' fortune. "You want to keep order?" Eloise screamed at him, her voice cracking with fury. "You want to be a soldier, then act like one save those men." She did not wait for his answer. She grabbed a lantern from a post and ran after Atsa. The scene at the mine was a vision of hell. The entrance was a jumble of shattered timbers and massive boulders. Dust coated everything in a ghostly gray. Men were digging frantically with their bare hands. Silas Kane was there. He was not digging. He was clawing at a pile of rocks near the office shack. "The ledger," Silas was screaming. "The vault key, it is in there." "Forget the money, you fool," Atsa shouted, appearing out of the smoke. He grabbed a heavy timber that was pinning a miner to the ground and heaved. His muscles corded, veins popping in his neck. "Pull him out!" 2 miners rushed in, dragging their injured comrade free. Atsa moved like a demon. He was everywhere lifting rocks, guiding dazed men away from the unstable edge, shouting orders in Navajo and English. The man who had been a prisoner 10 minutes ago was now the only thing standing between life and death for the men who had built the gallows. "Help him!" Eloise yelled. Arriving at the top, she threw herself into the line of men passing buckets of water and rocks. Suddenly, a secondary rumble shook the ground. "Get back!" Atsa roared. The ground beneath the main office gave way. Silas Kane, still frantically digging for his fortune, looked up. His eyes met Eloise's for a split second. There was no repentance in them, only a terrified realization that his gold could not stop gravity. The earth opened. Silas screamed as he slid backward, falling into the collapsing shaft along with the debris of his empire, a massive slab of sandstone, the silver ore glittering mockingly in its face, crashed down on top of him, sealing the hole with a final, dusty thud. Silence followed the roar. "Silas!" Eloise gasped, stepping forward. "Stay back!" Atsa was standing near the edge of the collapse. He was covered in gray dust, blood streaming from a fresh gash on his shoulder. He coughed, bending over, his body racked with spasms. The dust began to settle. The soldiers arrived, finally, led by a shamed Colonel Briggs. They looked at the sealed mine. They looked at the survivors huddled by the water barrels. And they looked at the Navajo warrior standing amidst the ruin. Atsa straightened up. He wiped the blood from his eyes. He did not look like a conquered man. He looked like the land itself, scoured, battered, but still standing. He walked slowly toward Eloise. The white miners parted for him, removing their hats. There were no jeers now. No one called him a savage. He stopped in front of Eloise. He reached out a dusty hand and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "You stayed," he rasped. "I am not fancy," Eloise whispered, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "I am just stubborn." Atsa leaned his forehead against hers. "Stubborn is good." Around them, the town of Red Rock Crossing watched in silence. The silver was gone. The villain was dead. But something new had been unearthed in the debris, something harder and more valuable than any ore. Colonel Briggs dismounted. He walked over to them, looking at the fake feathers that Eloise still clutched in her left hand. And then, at the sealed tomb of his partner, he took off his hat. "We will need statements," Briggs said, his voice hollow. "For the inspector." "You will have them," Eloise said, not moving away from Atsa. "You will have every word, and I will draw you a map of exactly where the bodies are buried." The climax had broken the world they knew. Now, they had to live in the wreckage. The dust from the collapsed mine did not settle for 3 days. It hung over Red Rock Crossing like a gray shroud, a constant reminder of the violence that had nearly consumed the valley. But when the air finally cleared, it brought with it a different kind of storm, the cold, bureaucratic scrutiny of the federal government. 3 weeks after the explosion, Inspector Harrison arrived from Santa Fe. He was a man of ink and paper, wearing a suit that seemed too heavy for the heat and spectacles that he constantly polished. He did not care about the romance of the frontier or the myth of the noble pioneer. He cared about liability, stolen government property, and unauthorized use of military force. The inquiry was held in the mess hall of the fort, the long wooden tables cleared of food and covered instead with evidence. Eloise Hart sat on a hard bench, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a simple dress she had mended herself, refusing to hide the bruises that were fading on her arms. On the table in front of Inspector Harrison lay the damning artifacts of Silas Kane's ambition. There was the headdress made of dyed chicken feathers and machine thread. There was the ledger Jamie had retrieved from the telegraph office. And there was Eloise's map, the one with the red crosses that marked human lives as obstacles to be removed. "Dr. Pembroke," Inspector Harrison said, looking over his spectacles at the nervous physician who had been on the stagecoach. "You examined the bodies of the so-called raiders." "I did, sir," Dr. Pembroke stammered, He looked at Colonel Briggs, who was sitting in a chair to the side, stripped of his sword and belt. The doctor swallowed hard. They were white men, Inspector. Their hair had been dyed with shoe polish, and they were wearing army-issue boots. Harrison made a note in his book. The scratching of his pen was the only sound in the room. He turned to Eloise. "Miss Hart," he said, "you claim that Mr. Kane admitted to these fabrications before his death. He did not admit it in a confession." "Inspector," Eloise said, her voice steady. "He boasted of it. He told me that rich men own the fire. He believed that the silver justified the slaughter." She pointed to the map. This survey was not commissioned by the government. It was a private enterprise to identify Navajo winter camps for destruction. Colonel Briggs was to provide the artillery to clear the canyon, under the pretense of suppressing a rebellion that did not exist. Colonel Briggs stood up, his face purple. "I was protecting this territory. These savages." "Sit down, Mr. Briggs," Inspector Harrison said. He did not use the rank. The omission hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "You used federal troops to facilitate a private land grab. You distributed government rifles to civilians to stage attacks on your own supply lines. That is not protection. That is treason." The verdict, when it came down 2 days later, was not the hanging that the mob had wanted for Atza, nor was it the firing squad that Briggs deserved. It was the slow, grinding crushing of a career. Colonel Briggs was relieved of command immediately. He was to be transported to Washington to face a court-martial, where he would likely be discharged in disgrace and stripped of his pension. He would not die, but his power was gone. The system had cracked, just enough to let the light in, though Eloise knew it would eventually seal itself shut again. As for the land, the victory was bitter but real. Inspector Harrison issued a temporary injunction against the railroad expansion. "The Department of the Interior will review the claim," he announced to the town council. "Until a new survey is conducted, an honest one, there will be a buffer zone established. No settlement and no mining within 10 miles of the canyon entrance. The Navajo are not to be disturbed." It was not a permanent promise. It was not a treaty carved in stone. But it was time. It was a breath of air for a people who had been drowning. The town of Red Rock Crossing was left to pick up the pieces. The mine, the beating heart of the local economy, was gone, buried under tons of sandstone. Many of the transient workers packed their bags and left, chasing the next rumor of gold in Nevada or California. But many stayed, and for those who remained, the atmosphere had shifted. Eloise walked down the boardwalk on a Tuesday morning. The sun was bright, but the hostility that had once radiated from the storefronts had evaporated, replaced by a complex, heavy silence. She passed the general store. Mrs. Gable, the woman who had hissed "Indian lover" at her weeks ago, was sweeping the porch. When she saw Eloise, she stopped. She did not smile. She did not wave, but she lowered her broom and nodded a stiff, awkward acknowledgement. The miners who had survived the collapse sat on benches, nursing their injuries. They watched Eloise pass with a mixture of confusion and begrudging respect. They remembered who had run up that hill. They remembered that while their boss was digging for a ledger, the savage was lifting beams off their legs. Shame is a powerful quiet. It dampened the loud, boisterous racism that had fueled the town. They could not call Atza a monster anymore, not without tasting the lie on their tongues. Eloise reached the small post office. She had a letter in her pocket, addressed to her sister in Ohio. It was a letter of resignation from her old life. She was just about to slide it into the slot when a voice called out, "Miss Hart!" She turned. It was Lydia, the saloon singer. She was wearing a modest day dress, the paint scrubbed from her face. Beside her stood Jamie, Eloise's brother, looking taller and more serious than the boy who had arrived on the stagecoach. "Lydia," Eloise said. "Jamie, is everything all right?" "We have been talking," Jamie said, stepping forward. "The mine is closed. A lot of families are out of work, but they are staying. They are trying to farm the valley floor. And they have children," Lydia added. She twisted her hands together nervously. "Children who run wild in the street." Children who cannot read a single word. Eloise looked at them, puzzled. What are you saying? We want to open a school, Lydia said, her voice gaining strength. Not a church school, just a place to learn, for everyone. The miners' kids, the Mexican kids from the laborers' camp. She paused, then looked Eloise in the eye. And maybe, if we can convince them, the Navajo children too. A school, Eloise repeated. We have the building, Jamie said. The old supply warehouse, but we need a teacher. Someone who knows mathematics, someone who knows geography, someone who knows the truth, Lydia said softly. You are the only one who stood up. Eloise, you taught this whole town a lesson without a blackboard. Imagine what you could do with one. Eloise looked at the letter in her hand. It was her ticket back to safety, back to tea parlors and libraries where no one knew her name. I am not a teacher, Eloise said. I am a cartographer. You map the world, Jamie said, smiling. Help these kids find their place in it. Eloise hesitated. Then, slowly, she put the letter back in her pocket. I will think about it, she said. But as she walked away, her step was lighter, 5 miles away, in the red dust of the temporary Navajo camp. Another debate was ending. Atsa Yazi stood by the corral, grooming the horse that had carried him through the storm. His shoulder was stiff from the injury at the mine, but the wound was closing. Around the fire, the elders were speaking. The mood was not celebratory. The Dine had kept their canyon. Yes, but the cost had been high. The innocence of their isolation was gone. A young warrior named Kla approached Atsa. Kla had lost a brother in a skirmish years ago, and his heart was still hard. Why did you save them? Kla asked, his voice bitter. The man Silas. The soldiers. You should have let the mountain swallow them all. It would have been justice. Atsa stopped brushing the horse. He looked at the younger man. Justice is a balance. Kla, revenge is a circle. If I had let them die when I had the power to save them, I would have become them. I would have been Briggs. I would have been Kane. They would not have saved you. Kla spat. I know, Atsa said calm. That is why we are better. That is why we are still here. Hastien Baye. The elder walked over. He placed a hand on Atsa's arm. You walk a strange path. Atsa, you walk between the Hogan and the Stonehouse. Some of the people say you have been touched too much by the white world. And what do you say? Grandfather Atsa asked. I say that the white world is here, the old man replied, looking toward the town. We cannot close our eyes to it. We need someone who can walk on the edge without falling. But it is a lonely walk. Atsa looked west, toward the deep mountains where the sun was beginning to dip. He could go there. He could disappear into the high pines, marry a Navajo woman, and never speak a word of English again. It would be easy. It would be safe. But then he thought of a map drawn with steady hands. He thought of a woman swinging an iron bar in a storm. He thought of honesty. I am not afraid of being lonely, Atsa said. I am afraid of being blind. The afternoon wind was cold when Eloise rode out to the canyon edge 2 days later. It was the spot overlooking the valley, where the red rock dropped away into a dizzying abyss. Atsa was waiting for her. He stood near the precipice, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, watching a hawk circle the thermals. Eloise dismounted and walked to stand beside him. They did not touch. They simply stood together, 2 small figures against the immense canvas of the desert. The soldiers are leaving, Eloise said. Briggs is gone. Another will come, Atsa said. But for now, the guns are quiet. Jamie wants me to stay, Eloise said. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. He wants to build a school. He wants me to teach. Atsa turned to look at her. And what does the mapmaker want? Eloise looked down at her hands. They were still rough. The desert had stripped away the softness she had tried so hard to maintain in Ohio. I am afraid, she admitted. The confession came out in a whisper, carried away by the wind. If I stay, I will never be one of them. The town will always see me as the woman who ran off, and I will never be Navajo. I cannot weave. I cannot speak the language well. I will be nothing, just stuck in the middle. She looked up at him. her eyes wide and vulnerable. "I'm afraid of belonging nowhere." Atsa watched her. His face was unreadable, carved from the same ancient stone as the canyon walls. "Do you know the story of the emergence?" he asked. Eloise shook her head. "My people believe we came up through 4 worlds," Atsa said, his voice rhythmic and low, "from the black world, to the blue, to the yellow, and finally to this one, the glittering world. In each world, there was chaos. In each world, we had to choose to move up, to change." He stepped closer to her. The distance between them vanished. "I walked the long walk," he said. "I saw the world end. I came back to a land that had changed. I did not fit in the old ways, and I hated the new ways. I was like you, floating." He reached out and took her hand. His skin was warm against hers. "But then I learned something," he continued. "You do not belong to a town. You do not belong to a tribe. You belong to the earth under your feet. And you belong to the truth you carry in your chest." He squeezed her hand. "You are not stuck in the middle. Eloise, you are the bridge. A bridge does not belong to one side of the river or the other. It belongs to the connection." Eloise felt a lump rise in her throat. "A bridge gets walked on," she said, a tear slipping down her cheek. "And a bridge stands when the flood comes," Atsa replied. "We stood. The mine fell. The kernel fell. We stood." He lifted her hand and pressed it against his chest, over his heart. She could feel the steady, slow rhythm of his life. "I am staying," Atsa said. "I will live near the trade route. I will talk to the white men and the dine. I will trade horses. I will keep the peace." He looked deep into her eyes. "But a bridge needs 2 pillars to stand. I cannot do it alone." Eloise looked at him. She saw the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the gray hairs starting to show at his temples. He was not a romantic fantasy. He was real. He was difficult. He was honest. "I am not pretty," she whispered, the old insecurity flaring one last time, a reflex of her past life. Atsa smiled. It was the same smile he had given her in the cave, slow, genuine, and full of light. "I told you," he said softly. "All the better. I do not need a flower that wilts in the sun. I need the rock that holds the heat." He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of burning passion or desperate hunger. It was a kiss of sealing. It tasted of dust and cold air and promise. It was a claiming. Not of ownership, but of partnership. When they broke apart, the sun was dipping below the horizon, setting the canyon on fire with light. "No church will marry us," Eloise said, her voice steady now. "The wind is my priest," Atsa said, looking out at the vast expanse. "The sun is my witness, and this land—" He stamped his boot on the red rock. "This is our altar." Eloise looked at the town in the distance, small and fragile in the twilight. Then she looked at the dark shape of the mountains where the Navajo camp lay. And finally, she looked at the space between them, the wild, untamed land where the school would be built, where the trade post would stand. "Then let us build," she said. She did not let go of his hand. They stood on the edge of the world as the stars began to come out, one by one, hard and bright and undeniable. They were outcasts. They were scarred. But as the falling action settled into the quiet rhythm of the night, they were no longer alone. They had chosen their world, and it was a world built not on blood or silver, but on the simple, terrifying courage of being honest. 4 years had passed since the mountain fell, and the wind that swept through Red Rock Crossing no longer smelled of dynamite and greed. It smelled of sagebrush, curing leather, and the sweet, dusty scent of rain waiting in the clouds. The town itself had changed. The frantic, feverish pulse of the silver boom had slowed to a steady, rhythmic beat. The Red Rock Mining Consortium still existed, but it was a shadow of its former self, picking at the lesser veins of ore far to the south, well away from the buffer zone established by the federal government. The railroad had come, as the Iron Horse always did, but the tracks curved like a respectful bow around the mouth of Coyote Canyon, adding 20 miles to the journey but keeping the peace. In the space between the shrinking town and the boundaries of the dying territory, a new structure had risen. It was not a fort, nor a saloon. It was a long, low building made of peeled logs and adobe, with a wide porch that faced the sunrise. Half of it was a trading post, a neutral ground where Navajo weavers brought their rugs and silversmiths brought their jewelry to trade for flour, coffee, and steel tools. The other half was a schoolhouse. Eloise's heart stood at the blackboard, the chalk dust settling on her sleeves. She was 31 years old now. The sun had deepened the lines around her eyes, and her hands were rougher than they had ever been, calloused from chopping wood and scrubbing floors. She wore a simple dress of blue calico, practical and sturdy, without a bustle or a corset to reshape her reality. To the people of the valley, she was beautiful. Geography, Eloise said, tapping the map she had drawn on the board. It was not a surveyor's map of claims and borders. It was a map of water sources, grazing trails, and the migration paths of the mule deer. In the small classroom, 12 children sat on wooden benches. 7 were Navajo, their hair tied back in heavy buns or braids. 5 were white, the children of the miners and ranchers who had stayed after the bust. "Who can tell me the name of this river in English and in Dene?" Eloise asked. A small hand shot up. It belonged to Jamie's son, a boy with hair like straw. "The Colorado," he said, "and Tunatsosiku." "Close," Eloise smiled. "But that is the little Colorado. Good try." "Thomas." Through the open window, she could hear the sounds of the trading post. She heard the clinking of harness rings and the low murmur of men negotiating prices. She looked out and saw him. Atsa Yazi was dismounting from his roan gelding. He moved a little slower now. The shoulder that had been crushed under the timber in the mine collapse stiffened when the weather turned cold. A thick, pale scar ran down his arm, visible when he rolled up his sleeves. But he held himself with the same quiet, dangerous grace that had saved her life in the canyon. He was no longer a fugitive. He was the bridge. When a rancher's cow wandered onto Navajo land, Atsa rode out to return it before tempers flared. When a young hothead from the reservation threatened a wagon train, Atsa was the one who sat by his fire and talked him down. He carried no badge, but he commanded more respect than the new sheriff ever could. He looked up at the window, sensing her gaze. He touched the brim of his hat, a battered Stetson that had replaced his headband, and offered a smile that was just for her. It was brief, honest, and grounded. That evening, as the sun began to bleed into the western horizon, turning the red rocks into pillars of fire, a gathering formed in the yard between the school and the trading post. It was not a holiday marked on any calendar. It was simply a Tuesday, but in this house, survival was cause enough for celebration. Hastian Bai, the Navajo elder, sat on a bench covered with a sheepskin, smoking a pipe. Beside him sat Lydia, the former saloon singer who now ran the trading post's dry goods section with a terrifying efficiency. Jamie, Eloise's brother, was manning a roasting pit where ears of corn and strips of beef sizzled over mesquite coals. There were no formal invitations. People just came, a few miners who had washed the coal from their faces, a group of Navajo weavers who laughed softly among themselves. Eloise walked among them, pouring lemonade from a pitcher. She felt a tug on her skirt. Looking down, she saw a little girl named Najoni. She was perhaps 8 years old, with a face full of freckles that stood out against her copper skin and 2 long braids tied with red yarn. Najoni was one of her brightest students, sharp as a tack and twice as bold. "Miss Eloise?" the girl asked, her dark eyes wide and serious. "Yes, Najoni." Eloise crouched down so they were eye to eye. The girl hesitated, glancing at the other children playing tag near the corral, then looked back at Eloise. "I heard the men in town talking, the old ones at the store." "What did they say?" Eloise asked, brushing a stray hair from the child's forehead. "They said—" Najoni lowered her voice. "They said you came here because you were not pretty. They said no man in the big cities wanted you, so you had to come to the rocks." The conversation around them seemed to dim. It was a cruel question, innocent in its delivery but barbed with the sting of Eloise's past insecurities. Eloise froze for a second. She remembered the mirror in the hotel room. She remembered Thomas's voice saying she was forgettable. She remembered the shame that had driven her onto that stagecoach 4 years ago. Then, she laughed. It was a warm, rich sound that bubbled up from her chest, free of bitterness. "Yes," Eloise said, holding the girl's gaze steadily. "They did say that. And do you know what? They were right, in their own way. I am not pretty like a painted doll in a shop window. I do not have silk skin, and I do not know how to flutter a fan." Najoni frowned, confused by the admission. "But is that why you stayed?" Eloise stood up and looked across the yard. Near the corral, Atsa was showing a group of boys mixed white and Navajo how to properly knot a cinch. He was patient, his hands moving with sure, practiced motions. He laughed at something one of the boys said, his head thrown back, his dark hair catching the last light of the sun. "No," Eloise said softly. "I stayed because I found someone who does not need fancy." She pointed to Atsa. "He needs honest." She looked back at the girl. "Do you understand the difference? Najoni fancy is for a night. Honest is for a lifetime. Fancy breaks when the storm comes. Honest holds the roof up." Najoni looked at Atsa, then looked at her own hands, which were dusty from playing in the dirt. She nodded slowly, a childish wisdom settling over her features. "Then I want to be honest too," Najoni declared firmly. "Not fancy." Eloise felt a lump rise in her throat. She reached out and smoothed the girl's hair. "Beauty walks with truth," she said, using the Navajo phrase Atsa had taught her during those long days in the cave. "Najoni go, hey." "Beauty walks with truth," Najoni repeated, smiling. Then, with the sudden shifting attention of a child, she turned and ran off to join the game of tag. Eloise watched her go, her heart full. Later that night, the guests had departed. The moon rose high and white, casting silver shadows across the desert floor. The silence returned, vast and comforting. Eloise sat at her small desk in the corner of the bedroom. She opened her leather-bound journal. It was filled not just with maps now, but with observations. The migration of the hawks, the rainfall measurements, the way the light hit the canyon walls at dawn. She dipped her pen in the inkwell and wrote, "He did not tame me. The desert did, the wind did, the years did. He only chose to walk beside what was already wild and worn and real." She blotted the ink and closed the book. She walked out onto the porch. The air was crisp, cooling rapidly after the heat of the day. Atsa was sitting on the top step, repairing a bridle by the light of a kerosene lantern. The smell of oil and leather hung in the air. He did not look up immediately. He finished threading a leather thong through a buckle, pulled it tight, and tested the strength of it. Only then did he raise his head. His hair hung loose around his shoulders, streaked now with a few strands of gray that matched the ones in Eloise's braid. His face was lined by the sun, a map of the life they had built together. The girl asked questions. Atsa said quietly. He didn't miss much. She asked about beauty. Eloise replied, sitting down on the step beside him. She did not sit delicately. She sat with the heaviness of a woman who had worked hard all day. "And what did the mapmaker tell her?" Atsa asked, turning the bridle in his hands. "I told her the truth," Eloise said. She leaned her shoulder against his. "That I am not a prize to be looked at." Atsa chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. He put the bridle down and reached for her hand. His palm was rough, scarred, and warm. He laced his fingers through hers. "The prize is not the rock that shines," Atsa said, looking out at the moonlit desert. "The prize is the rock that bears the weight." He turned to look at her. In the pale light, his eyes were as dark and deep as the night sky. There were no grand declarations. There was no poetry of the poets back east. There was only the undeniable fact of his presence. He was there. He would be there tomorrow. "You are tired," he said. "A good tired," Eloise answered. "Tomorrow. The horses need shoeing," Atsa said. "And the roof needs patching before the winter rains. And the children need to learn their multiplication tables," Eloise added. It was a litany of chores. It was a list of burdens, but to Eloise, it sounded like a love song. It was the promise of a future that required work, sweat, and endurance. Atsa lifted her hand to his lips and kissed the calluses on her palm. Then he looked at her, and his expression softened into that rare, unguarded look he saved only for her. "I am glad you got off that stagecoach," he whispered. "I am glad you followed the thieves." Eloise replied. They sat there in the silence, listening to the wind sing through the canyon. It was the same wind that had once terrified her, the same wind that had tried to kill them in the haboob. Now, it was just the breath of their home. Below the porch, the red dust of the yard lay still. In the morning, the children would return. They would run across that earth, their laughter echoing between the two worlds, the world of the dying and the world of the newcomers. They would grow up knowing that a man could be a warrior without a gun, and a woman could be a hero without a pretty face. Eloise rested her head on Atsa's shoulder. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the wooden boards. They did not need to speak anymore. They had the honesty of the earth beneath them. And for the mapmaker and the warrior, that was all the fancy they would ever need. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Eloise and Atsa touched your heart as much as it did mine. If you enjoyed this tale of the Wild West, please take a moment to scroll down and leave a comment. I would love to know where you are listening from. Let's see how far this story has traveled. Are you in a bustling city or a quiet town like Red Rock Crossing? Please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, for more stories about the frontier, the grit, and the romance of the old days. Don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and if you really want to help this story reach more people, please press the hype button. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these legends alive. Stay honest, not fancy. See you on the next trail.